some tech people and some urban planners have come together to look at building a brand new city from scratch in Northern California. And I think the interesting thing about this, it's not like this hasn't been tried before. It's been tried in many, many places. This is the largest one that's been tried in North America, really since I think Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was envisioned as a city in the middle of nowhere, city from scratch that was going to be built. This is the kind of first modern one, let's say, the first post automobile, post World War II, post suburbs kind of city at this scale that's been proposed in North America. I'm a civil engineer. I'm a land use planner. This is kind of the dream of every planner, right? To start from scratch and build the perfect utopian city from scratch. The idea is that, California has a huge demand for new housing. California has a huge demand for people to move and live close to each other in a tech community. The idea is to take and build that perfect urban design tech utopia, get a bunch of people living together in a place and let them be, very creative, kind of almost like a Silicon Valley 2.0, like an escape from San Francisco and some of the maybe difficulties that have happened there, a little oasis for tech people. In terms of like the marketing materials that are being put forth for this, the unique thing about it is that they're building with new urbanist principles, and new urbanist principles really are a throwback to the way cities used to be built, more tightly compacted, more walkable. Don't think big towers and tenements, but think, row houses and kind of nicely designed blocks. That's the vibe they're going for, and that's the overall aesthetic. It's an older, more traditional way of building, but with modern amenities. So obviously modern technology, but also modern things like how you pick up the trash and how you get around, and, modern transit systems and all that. There's a de-emphasis on the automobile. There is an emphasis on biking, walking, and transit. And with 400,000 people, it's not like you're designing a neighborhood. You're designing multiple neighborhoods and then stitching them together. So it's quite an undertaking. I think it's an interesting vision. A lot of the ideas behind the urban design are very good. They've been tried in many, many places. But there's a lot more that goes into building a city than goes into, say, building a software package or a tech hub, or even, as an urban planner, into envisioning what the ultimate thing will look like. It's a lot of steps along the way. I think there's really three areas of major challenge that is going to hit them right off the bat. The first one is just that it's very, very hard to phase in something like this. When you look at the idea of 400,000 people living in a place, if you could just drop that in as a finished product, as a finished state, I think you'd be very successful of it. No city's built that way. It's always kind of phased in over time. And so what you have is this, I think, complex phasing challenge. Let me give you like one example. If you're going to have a grocery store in a neighborhood, that grocery store has got to have patrons in order for it to be economically viable. But if the neighborhood is scheduled to grow from 500 people to 5,000 people to 50,000 people, at some point that grocery store doesn't scale, right? It needs enough people there originally, but then you outgrow it very, very quickly. The way that the city is being presented and the way it's being designed and built is that it's going to be built, in a sense, to a finished state right off the bat. And so do you build a big, huge grocery store for the 50,000 people in that neighborhood that you think are going to access it? Do you build it for the 500 people that are initially going to be there? At what point do you phase this? And at what point does it become a viable thing? Other cities that have tried to do this on a smaller scale have struggled with that commercial residential interplay. How quickly do we do these things? How quickly do we phase them in? You have the other problem of just the infrastructure. I mean, a lot of this infrastructure doesn't scale very easily. So when you go out and build, say, a water system, do you size your water system for 50,000 people, 100,000 people, the full 400,000 people? The economics of building it all completely, in a sense, is much, much cheaper. In other words, if you can get the cash and get the capital, you can build that and your per unit cost will be much lower. But all of a sudden, the incentives around your development start to change. Cities get into this problem all the time. They overbuild their capacity and then they backfill it because they need the cash flow, they need the revenue. But the returns on those investments tend to be a lot lower. You see cities running sewer and water out and then all of a sudden hooking up, storage units to it, which don't need sewer and water, but produce tax revenue. They get impatient waiting for the tax revenue to get there. The way that they are imagining this creates a lot of phasing problems that maybe they pondered and thought about, but tech people tend to not struggle with those kind of things. Those are the kind of things that scaling in a tech industry is create your prototype and then build it up and deal with issues. And that's just not how cities are built. The third challenge is really a regional integration kind of thing. The idea here is that this will be a separate city. It won't be a city that is, let's say, a bedroom community of San Francisco. Yet, if they're going to get the upfront capital, the upfront people to move there, they're not necessarily going to have the industry, the business, the offices, the things that would keep people local. There's going to be a certain amount of commuting back and forth. That commuting, that back and forth, that integration with the region is going to create a certain amount of demand for, let's just say, regional assistance, regional partnership, regional cooperation. When you look at California in general, you look at Caltrans, you look at the city of San Francisco and Oakland and just the Bay Area itself, all of these governments are overstressed. They're overcommitted. They're overextended. And the idea that we would just kind of layer on 400,000 people or ultimately, systems for 400,000 people in a region like this onto that without overly stressing the regional infrastructure is just not realistic. I think the alternative plan to kind of feather this in or layer this in neighborhoods throughout California, the project opponents say, we should do that too. They call it infill. We should do infill everywhere. And I get that. But the idea of dropping, a brand new city in this stretch, I think we're underplaying or underselling the amount of stress this will create on that regional infrastructure, particularly the transportation infrastructure. Well, their thoughts are that people won't drive as much internally, right? Once you're there at this new city, there won't be a lot of demand for automobile trips because you'll be able to get around easier by other means. And that's certainly a viable sense. But you cannot grow a city from 0 to 400,000 and have every phase of it be kind of internally contained. Each phase of it is going to have significant interactions with the outside world. And at the beginning, the first 10,000, 20,000, 40,000 people are going to be very, very connected to the outside world by its very nature. There's not, in a sense, think about building a city as getting a fire going, right? You start with a little bit of kindling and you kind of blow on it and then it starts to get going. It takes a while to get to that place where it's internally a viable thing, where it's kind of generating its own heat. In that phase-in period of time, which is going to take decades, there's going to be significant demand for regional infrastructure, demand that nobody's taken into account up to this point. In the context of California, you're seeing this in a state like California, not just because there's a lot of money in Silicon Valley and there's a lot of people who idealize this, but because the deep dysfunction that is the California development pattern. You do have the most bizarre kind of circumstances of development in the entire country, really in all of North America, take place in California. And from Prop 13 to the CEQA rules to the way Caltrans does transportation, all this has created this dysfunction that in this case is manifesting with this kind of throw up your hands and say, well, what can we do? Let's just start over from scratch and try to do it right. I think it's an interesting response to stress. It's not the response that I would take. I'd like to see California fix a lot of their rules and regulations and things that are preventing good development from happening in other places. But, if you got a lot of money and you're sick of rules and regulations, it's one way to kind of chart your own path and try to build something better.